It was the beginning of a new year. January mornings in Tampa are usually quiet, a little brisk but calm. On one of those early days of 2023, a man named Omer Abdullah was waking up with his family in their modest apartment on the second floor of a building in the city. He lived there with his pregnant wife and their little daughter. At first, everything seemed like a typical morning, the kind where you sip warm tea, hear the hum of the fridge, footsteps from the unit downstairs, and think nothing of it. But not long into the new year, things started to feel off. At first, it was small, almost imperceptible. Omar began waking up with a headache. It wasn't the kind of headache that would knock you out or make you want to stay in bed all day. No, it was a dull, persistent throb that seemed to cling to the back of his skull, the kind of headache you might just try to brush it off, thinking it was stress or lack of sleep. But it didn't go away, it lingered, and the more it stayed, the more disorienting it became. The mornings grew colder, the city settling into a strange, almost oppressive quiet. Umar wasn't the only one who felt it. His wife, who was pregnant, also started to complain of nausea. It was subtle at first, just a few waves of dizziness here and there. Nothing alarming, yet enough to make her pause and wonder. The strange thing, it wasn't just one person, it was like the air around them had changed. A heaviness, a weird, unshakable feeling of being off balance. And then their little daughter, who had always been full of energy, started to act differently. She was sluggish, her face looked pale, her eyes listless as she crawled into their bed in the morning, seeking comfort. It wasn't normal for her to lie there so still. She too started having nosebleeds. Umar had never seen anything like this before. Still, they tried to go about their lives, but the symptoms weren't letting up. His wife began to complain of headaches, not just any headaches, sharp, stabbing ones that came on without warning. Sometimes it felt like her entire face was being squeezed from the inside. The dizziness got worse, and then there was the smell. It started faintly at first, a scent that Umar couldn't place. It wasn't something he could pinpoint. It wasn't the typical smell of a gas leak, and it wasn't the musty odor of old wood or wet carpeting. It was chemical, sharp, almost like something burned, but it would come and go, almost as if it was slipping in and out of existence, right under his nose. He couldn't quite figure out where it was coming from. He would check the vents, the kitchen, even the bathroom, but it never seemed to linger anywhere long enough for him to trace it. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't natural. The family had never experienced anything like this before. Their apartment was quiet, tucked away from the noise of the world outside. They had no enemies, no reason for anyone to want to harm them. It seemed absurd to even think about it. But then came the day when the dizziness became overwhelming, and his wife collapsed onto the couch, clutching her head, her face drawn in pain. That's when Umar decided something had to be wrong. This couldn't be just a coincidence anymore. Whatever was happening in their apartment was not natural. At first, he tried to reassure himself. Maybe it was a plumbing issue, or maybe the building's old pipes were causing problems. Maybe it was mold in the walls, but deep down he knew it wasn't just that. The feeling in the air had shifted. Omar couldn't wait any longer. He installed a camera near the front door, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything that might explain what was going on. He didn't know what he was expecting to find. Perhaps he was hoping to catch a glimpse of a leak, or maybe some other harmless explanation. But when he reviewed the footage the next day, his blood ran cold. There, in the dim light of the hallway, was his downstairs neighbor, Lee. Omer watched almost in disbelief as Lee carefully crouched near the door, holding a syringe. His hands were steady as he slid the needle under the door frame, and in one swift motion, he injected something into the apartment. Omar's heart raced. This was no harmless prank. It was a deliberate act. Someone had been poisoning his family. The next few hours were a blur of confusion and panic. Omar contacted the authorities, and soon after, a team of hazmat specialists arrived at the apartment. They took samples of the air and tested it for any dangerous chemicals. The results came back quickly. The substance was identified as methadone and hydrocodone, two powerful opioids, the kind that could cause long-term damage if inhaled or ingested over time. Umar was left standing in his own apartment, unable to process the reality of what had just been revealed. The person who had been silently poisoning his family for weeks, the neighbor they never thought twice about, was someone he had seen in passing, someone he thought was just another tenant. It did not make sense. The investigation turned up more details. Lee, a chemistry PhD student at the University of South Florida, had been under pressure. Neighbors reported him as being reclusive, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself. No one could have imagined that the soft-spoken neighbor, who seemed harmless enough, was capable of such a chilling act. He had been slipping chemicals under the door every day, poisoning the very air they breathed. Ammar's family was lucky. They were treated for the exposure and eventually recovered. But the trauma, the horror of knowing that someone they had trusted had been slowly destroying them from the shadows lingered. The illness that once filled the apartment could never be erased. Lee was not sentenced to prison in the USA. Instead, after his arrest on charges, he pled not guilty, was released on bond, and in late 2023 was deported back to China, effectively cutting short any U.S. legal proceedings. Omar still wonders how it all happened, how something as simple as a strange smell could lead to something so dark, how his family, in the midst of a quiet life, had been living under the threat of a silent poison, and how they had never seen it coming. Sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we hear about on the news. The most horrific things are the ones we can't even see.